1798, a young man of about 15 named Washington Irving left his Manhattan home to avoid the yellow fever outbreak. He made his way up the Hudson River to healthier climes, staying with friends in Tarrytown. Irving was an imaginative boy, proudly bearing the name of our nation's founder, George Washington, who he had a chance to meet as a child. It was while he was in Tarrytown that he learned of nearby Sleepy Hollow, and along with it, its Dutch heritage and local ghost stories. He would wander the graveyard at the old Dutch church, read the names off the stones, and imagine these ghost stories come to life. Sleepy Hollow's most infamous specter was the Headless Horseman, a Hessian soldier who is said to have had his head blown off by a cannon in a battle during the American Revolutionary War. The Hessian was buried in an unmarked grave here in the church burial ground, and was said to rise from the grave, tormenting the local townsfolk in a nightly quest for his head. It was from these stories, and the people he met and places he saw in and around Sleepy Hollow as a youth, that years later, while in Europe, Washington Irving would pen the short story for which he is best known, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, in 1820. Tales of Headless Horsemen were a familiar part of European folklore dating back to the Middle Ages. But The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, one of America's very earliest pieces of folklore, is perhaps the most widely known today. It tells the tale of a lanky schoolmaster named Ichabod Crane, a newcomer to Tarrytown from Connecticut. He had the appearance of a scarecrow eloped from a cornfield, and an appetite for the finer things in life. He could nary afford them, but as schoolmaster his pension came in the form of room and board, of pastries and pies, sweet meats and apple cider, courtesy of the local housewives. Ichabod also had an eye for the young ladies of the town, who saw him as a gentlemanly personage, a learned man of letters with vastly superior eloquence and taste when compared to the rough country boys. Strolling the church burial grounds, he would recite for the damsels' amusement all the epitaphs on the tombstones. And by night he would share in the telling of tales of ghosts and goblins with the old Dutch wives as they sat spinning, particularly tales of the Headless Horseman. And though he had seen many specters in his time, he would have passed a pleasant life of it, in spite of the devil and all his works, if his path had not been crossed by a being that causes more perplexity to mortal man than ghosts, goblins, and the whole race of witches put together. And that was a woman. One of his singing pupils was a coquettish, blooming lass of fresh 18 named Katrina Van Tassel, plump as a partridge, ripe and rosy-cheeked as one of her father's peaches. Her character was based on a real resident of Sleepy Hollow, whose grave can be found here in the old Dutch church burial ground. Ichabod had a soft and foolish heart, which quickly fell for the young Katrina, and he began to vie for her hand in earnest. But Ichabod had a rival in his romantic pursuit, village hero and town prankster, Brom Bones, who also vied for Katrina's affections. To try and deter Ichabod, Brom Bones played a series of pranks on him, but Ichabod was unswayed in his pursuits. See, Ichabod was as interested in Katrina's inheritance as he was in Katrina herself. So he may bend easily, but he does not break. One fine autumnal day, a messenger arrived, inviting Ichabod to a party at the Van Tassels. Donning his very best in order to impress his mistress, he mounted a borrowed, broken-down plow horse and issued forth to the Van Tassel estate. After filling his belly with every sweet morsel offered in the fall harvest buffet, music from the great hall summoned Ichabod and all the party-goers to the dance. The lady of his heart was his partner in the dance, while the sorely smitten Brom Bones sat alone in a corner. As the evening wore on, the gaiety gave way to the more somber activity of reciting tales of ghosts and apparitions, particularly those in neighboring Sleepy Hollow. There was a contagion that blew from the very air of that haunted region. It breathed forth an atmosphere of dreams and fancies. The chief part of the stories turned about to the region's favorite specter, the Headless Horseman, who had been heard of late patrolling the countryside, and tethered his horse nightly among the graves in the churchyard. The old Dutch church was a favorite haunt of troubled spirits. Nearby rolls a large brook, spanned by a wooden bridge that leads to the church. This was the place where the horseman was most frequently encountered, and was said to disappear upon arrival at the bridge. Brombones affirmed that even he had been overtaken by this midnight marauder, racing him to the bridge when suddenly the Hessian vanished in a flash of fire. Ichabod Crane was a superstitious man, easily spooked and quick to believe the ghost stories told sotto voce in the dark. When the party ended and the revel gradually broke up, Ichabod lingered in hopes of finalizing his courtship of Katrina. But in the end, she rejected him, and Ichabod, crestfallen, was forced to make his way home through the dark countryside, alone. It was the witching hour, and as he sojourned, his mind replayed the tales told this evening, and all things became menacing spooks to him. A large crooked tree, the guttural twang of a bullfrog, and the rustling of the wind. Then, in the dark shadow of the grove, on the margin of the brook, he beheld something huge and towering. It was a horseman, mounted on a powerful black steed. He came up alongside them on the road. Ichabod quickened his steed in hopes of leaving this unwelcomed companion behind. But the horseman kept pace. Ichabod was horror-struck on perceiving that he was headless. But his horror was still more increased on observing the head that should have rested on his shoulders was carried before him on the pommel of his saddle. Ichabod's terror rose to desperation, and with several kicks to his horse he sped away. They dashed through the woods, the horseman ever on his tail. They plunged toward the bridge and church where Ichabod was sure the horseman would disappear. He fought with his might to stay atop his broken-down plow horse, despite losing his saddle in their flight. If I can but reach that bridge, thought Ichabod, I am safe. He heard the black steed panting and blowing close behind him. Another kick and his horse thundered across the bridge, gaining the opposite side. Ichabod cast his gaze behind to see if his pursuer would indeed vanish, according to the legend. Just then he saw the goblin rising in his stirrups and in the very act of hurling his head at him. It encountered his cranium with a tremendous crash, and he tumbled headlong to the ground as the horseman passed by, like a whirlwind. The next morning, Ichabod's old horse was found back at the farm. But there was no sign of Ichabod. Only his hat was discovered on the ground near the bridge, next to a shattered pumpkin. Some said the events were a prank by Brombones to eliminate his romantic rival and finally win the hand of fair Katrina. But the old country wives, who were the best judges of these matters, maintain to this day that Ichabod Crane was spirited away by the galloping Hessian. After living in various places in the US and Europe, Washington Irving spent his final years in and around Tarrytown and Sleepy Hollow. He died on November 28, 1859, at the age of 76. He was buried here in the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. Over the years, treasure hunters would chip away at pieces of his gravestone, so it's had to be replaced. His grave now gated off in this private area. Sleepy Hollow was a town, Irving said, where a drowsy, dreamy influence seems to hang over the land and to pervade the very atmosphere. 200 years later, that still holds true. If you come to visit Sleepy Hollow, come in October. But be wary at the stroke of midnight on Halloween, for you might just lose your head.